This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we interview authors of books and studies and other things that we find interesting. If you like us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find out all about it on our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review.
And we're very happy to welcome our guest today. He's speaking to us from Berkeley, California. Saeed Atshan is an assistant professor of peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College. He previously served as a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International Studies. He did his PhD at Harvard in Anthropology and Middle East Studies. He's currently on sabbatical for the 2022-2021 academic year at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's got two books out, another on the way, and we will be talking about Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique, published by Stanford University Press in 2020. Saeed, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. I want to start out with a very, very broad question. For those people who are not kind of inside the world of the internal dynamics of activism around the Palestinian issue, what is the relationship actually between LGBTQ activism and Palestinian solidarity in a big sense? Because I'm thinking people who aren't really inside this might not really even understand why there's a connection at all.
Yes, well, many people are often surprised to discover that the Middle East, North Africa region has vibrant LGBTQ social movements. And Palestine is one context in which we have a really vibrant queer movement and queer civil society. And it has been spearheaded by mainly courageous queer women in the Palestinian solidarity movement who've built an inspiring movement in Israel-Palestine focused on liberation for queer Palestinians. And that has been global in its reach now in terms of impacting queer movements all over the world who identify solidarity with LGBTQ Palestinians and Palestinians more broadly.
And why do you think it was spearheaded mostly by women?
Well, I think that the queer Palestinian movement is a byproduct of the Palestinian feminist movement, and Palestinian feminists have historically articulated the need to combine the struggle for national liberation with the struggle for the liberation of women as well. They see those two struggles as inextricably linked. And most queer Palestinian activists, men or women or gender nonconforming, also identify as feminists. So I think that the queer Palestinian movement was a natural extension of the broader feminist movement.
You write that LGBT activism in Palestine started around 2002 and then grew until it plateaued in 2012. Can you take us through the growth and meanders of the movement and point out why these two specific dates are key?
Well, 2002 is where we begin to see queer Palestinians claiming public space and where we begin to see Israelis of conscience, progressive queer Israelis, joining the queer Palestinian struggle for rights and for dignity, as well as queer Palestinians in diaspora communities joining the movement, supporting the movement, and it rises and it experiences tremendous growth. In 2012, I argue that the movement begins to experience plateau. And what I mean by plateau is that it's not growing at the rate it was in its initial years, but it's also not slowing down. It's sort of remaining at a steady pace. And the reason that it's plateauing is because the movement is experiencing what I call in my book an empire of critique, where queer Palestinians are facing increasing surveillance, criticism, policing from Israeli authorities and institutions, Palestinian authorities and institutions, Western-based filmmakers, journalists, academics, people who are, within the Palestinian family unit can sometimes contribute to that empire of critique and policing and surveillance. And finally, sometimes fellow activists can surveil one another. And as a result of being under so many regimes and layers of surveillance and criticism, the movement it can't keep up with the number of directions that criticisms are coming from. And as a result, I think it's slowing down the growth of the movement.
It's interesting that in 2002, it was really the height of the second intifada. And I wouldn't like to suggest, you're a social scientist, this is a big no-no, that a correlation suggests causation. But it's interesting to note that it came right at the time just after the collapse of the peace process of the 1990s. And do you think that the receding of the peace process in one way or another allowed more space for this kind of activism to prosper?
I think that's very insightful. And again, you're so apt to distinguish between correlation and causation. So I don't think either one of us would insinuate that there's causation, but I think the correlation is there for sure. And in the context of the second intifada in the early 2000s, what we saw is that Palestinians were capturing the hearts and minds and imaginations of people around the world. The sort of global theater was focused so much on the occupied Palestinian territories and the Palestinian struggle for freedom under Israeli military occupation. And in that context, with that growing global consciousness and recognition, in LGBTQ Palestinians were able to find an entry point to this global recognition as well. But I do think that over time, Palestinians are taking increasingly a backseat in terms of the global stage or the global theater as other humanitarian crises emerge in the region and around the world, as well as regional developments in the Middle East change the landscape of the Middle East. I don't think that Palestinians are appearing on television screens around the world and even in the region as much as they did during the earlier stage.
Okay, I want to get back to the movement building, but even before that, I still want to kind of tease out one of the observations that you make, which I think is very important for setting the stage. You make the point that Palestinian society can't really make social changes to fight homophobia and accept queerness or combat, high levels of intolerance until the occupation is over. And it seems to me that that is, some parallels to some extent, the feminist struggle and the question of whether you can truly see a gender equality movement disconnected somehow from liberation from occupation. I would still like you to explain why that is. If I've got it right, you can also correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it.
No, absolutely. I think, we have to take responsibility as a Palestinian society for our own internal systems of oppression, whether it's sexism or homophobia. But I do think that the overall context of the Israeli occupation and its brutality, the gross violations of human rights, exacerbates these dynamics within our society. And as a result, I don't think we can have true queer liberation unless we also have national liberation. It's impossible to establish and create a vibrant, pluralistic, truly inclusive society if the society overall is not free in terms of political freedom. But I also caution us from thinking that we can't begin the struggle for queer liberation until national liberation has been achieved. I think that the two struggles actually have to happen simultaneously, and they are, as I said before, inextricably linked. I think that the struggle against imperialism and the struggle against homophobia have many, many parallels, and they intersect in really critical ways. And as a result, we cannot divorce the two.
Can you explain what queer liberation means for you in the Palestinian context? What would be like major achievements for that movement to succeed?
Well, for example, when we think about visibility politics, we realize that for many queer people, the politics of visibility is actually a privilege that they don't have, that they cannot afford, and that being visible can lead to danger for them, for their bodies, for their lives, for their families. And I would never, ever want to impose a queer liberation project onto someone, especially in terms of visibility, if it would come at such devastating consequences for them. At the same time, the possibility of invisibility is not a privilege that many of us can have either. So, for example, effeminate queer men, not just in Palestinian society, but all around the world, even if they don't identify as queer or take on such a label or take on such a political project, they themselves already are marked, their bodies, their voices, as women-like, as and this also is linked to sexism, and they can be met with violence, with intolerance, etc. And we have the right to advocate for our rights, for our dignity, to advocate to be able to lead lives that are free of physical harm, of structural violence. So for me, a queer liberation struggle is a struggle that's heterogeneous, that's multidimensional, and that's deeply contextual, and that it includes everyone, but also includes queer people and LGBTQ individuals in a way that's sensitive to their circumstances and recognizes that we all have different levels of positionalities and privileges that make our contributions to the struggle, for some much more private, for others much more public. So it's really that big tent, big umbrella approach. That's my vision for the movement and for the queer Palestinian liberation struggle.
So in what ways is Palestine different from other conservative societies in the Middle East and elsewhere?
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, Gilad, because I was going to ask something very similar, but based on something that Said pointed out in the book, which is that according to the Arab Barometer, intolerance of queerness is very, very high in the Palestinian territories. I think you note 95% express intolerant attitudes. And so my question, similar to Gilad, is that particularly high, even relative to other conservative societies?
Well, we have among the highest rates of intolerance vis-a-vis queerness in terms of the survey data and the polling data. It's demonstrating that time and time again. The Middle East region in general has among the highest rates in the world. And then even within the Middle East region, the Palestinian territories stand out as a result. But I think that we have parallels with, neighboring countries and other parts of the world where homophobia is a real problem, but we also have unique circumstances. And what's unique to our context is that we live under Israeli military occupation. We live under Israeli settler colonialism and Israeli apartheid, as B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights organization, has just released a report that Israel is practicing apartheid against Palestinians, both in Israel proper and in the occupied Palestinian territories. And this Israeli settler colonial project has appropriated queer bodies and queer subjects in certain ways. And this brings me to the topic of pinkwashing, the way that so many actors try to draw attention to an advanced LGBTQ rights record in Israel in order to detract attention away from violations of Palestinian human rights. And I think that this, combined with the Israeli security and intelligence services entrapment of LGBTQ Palestinians to serve as informants, collaborators, etc., makes our context quite unique, the Palestinian context. And as I said before, exacerbates homophobia within our society. Again, I don't think we can blame Israel for all of our homophobia. That would be irresponsible. We have to take that responsibility. But at the same time, Israel's practices for decades now, the Israeli state's practices, definitely don't help, and in fact actually hurt the struggle for queer liberation.
I want to pick up on what you just said. I mean, the idea that pinkwashing is a distraction is a way to say, okay, everything, we're great with relation to LGBT stuff, therefore you can forget the occupation. I consider that an attempted distraction. But the other side of it, which you just mentioned, is Israel's interventionist approach to using homosexuality. And I think that it bears expanding upon for those who, again, are not inside of it. Your book is very informative in some of those examples. Can you give us a couple of examples of those kinds of things where Israel, specifically because of occupation policies, leverages the issue and inserts the issue of LGBT, the situation among Palestinians as part of its occupation practices?
Yes, and I want to be clear that the LGBTQ community in Israel has worked very hard to secure rights. Obviously, Israel is not a queer utopia, and homophobia is a problem within Israeli society as well. But there is queer empowerment and queer agency within Israeli society that is possible. Also in Palestinian society, there are possibilities, very real possibilities for queer agency as well, and we see that all the time. But I would never want to. I want to be clear that what I'm saying is not that the LGBTQ community in Israel is thinking, okay, let's organize for our rights so that we can detract or distract attention from the issue of Palestine and Palestinian human rights. But what happens is that you have particular actors, for instance, state actors, Israeli state actors and others, who focused on the former precisely in order to detract attention away from the latter. And an example of this, for instance, was the killing of Muhammad Abu Khdeir, the Palestinian teenager from East Jerusalem who was burned alive by several Israeli extremists. And after he was really brutally murdered, and all of a sudden we see the Israeli police in Jerusalem releasing statements that there's a chance that he was killed by his family in an honor killing because they suspected that he could have been gay. Now, we don't know if he was gay or not. He was a teenager. He was very young. We have no evidence for that at all. So that's actually quite homophobic. But on the family having to mourn the death of their son, and then on top of that, have to respond to these public false accusations that they themselves murdered their own son because he was gay was incredibly traumatic, not only for them, but for so many queer Palestinians and Palestinians writ large. And it was a quintessential example of pinkwashing, the way that at that moment, rather than try to take responsibility for the Israeli occupation, Israeli settlers, the rise of extremism and fundamentalism and violence among Israeli extremists, all of a sudden there's an attempt to deflect the attention away from that and to instead say, look, the Palestinians themselves are these violent homophobes, and let's continue dehumanizing them.
But I have to respond. I think the irony is that, of course, in order to respond to that, they have to deny it and say, no, of course he wasn't that, which in a way makes the debate even worse.
Yes, absolutely. Would you say that this is really what, how it's perceived by the broader Palestinian population as this detracting attention away from the national struggle? The fact that are gay Palestinians immediately suspected as collaborators because it's so associated, the two are so associated, and also pinkwashing as a clear Israeli policy is seen as playing into the hands of Israel in that respect?
Yes, because these images are so salient and they travel in such hegemonic spheres globally, and average Palestinians, they see this. They see how Israel continues to market itself as a gay haven, as a gay utopia, continues to market Tel Aviv pride, continues to draw attention to this, fabulous queer scene and attracting tourism and all of that. They see how much investment is going into this propaganda and into these efforts, and they feel excluded. And they know simultaneously that they are not just excluded from rights, from access to these spaces, etc., but that from their perspective, the colonial power is instrumentalizing and weaponizing discourses of queerness and homophobia, that Palestinian society is deeply homophobic, in order to make the case that Palestinians should continue to live under occupation and be subjugated. And as a result, Palestinians see this, and there's a visceral reaction against this. And I would argue that this then provokes more people into becoming more homophobic, unfortunately,
so you think
because
that
queerness then gets associated with the Israeli colonial project. And what the queer Palestinian movement is trying to do is to decouple that and to say, no, we need to be able to have a discourse of queerness, a political project of queerness that's deeply Palestinian and isn't mired in these colonial dynamics.
So then how do they address the great crossover that there is, that you pointed out earlier, between LGBT activism in the Palestinian territories and in Israel? You say that there's a lot of cross-fertilization.
Cross-fertilization between Palestinian activists. So these are LGBTQ Palestinian citizens of Israel and LGBTQ Palestinians who are stateless living in the occupied territories, who are working together across the Green Line and forging those connections. But mainstream Jewish Israeli LGBTQ civil society and Palestinian LGBTQ civil society, both within Israel and the occupied territories, continue to be largely separate.
And so when you talked about how the LGBT, the sort of pinkwashing issue becomes conflated with Zionist, I guess Zionism, but in its occupation and colonial form, is that one of the reasons why you would say there's, or at least measurably in surveys, higher levels of intolerance than in even other neighboring countries? Because it's not just the conservative religious element to society, but it's also because it's conflated with the policies of occupation.
I would argue that it's definitely a factor, and we can't deny that that's a factor, while at the same time not eliding the very real conservative forces within our society that also lead to such high rates of homophobia. Those are very real as well. And it would be irresponsible, I think, to deny the former or the latter.
Sure, it can be both. Let's talk more about the movement. So I was interested when you talked about the plateau. Gilad mentioned at the beginning. I got this image in my mind, not of a glass ceiling for activism, but an enmeshed ceiling, like a ceiling with many enmeshed forces. But they're not the same forces, right? They're different. One of them is within the movement itself. You talk about ideological purity, and some of them are delegitimizers coming from other parts of the world. Can you try to pull apart some of the strands that are holding down the growth of the movement?
Yes, well, in terms of this empire of critique, of course, the Israeli authorities continue the occupation, continue with trying to entrap LGBTQ Palestinians within Palestinian society, religious institutions, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas. They continue with their sanctioning of homophobia in different ways. In the international sphere, some internationals can be in solidarity. Other internationals engage in a kind of anti-solidarity vis-a-vis the queer movement in Palestine that continues through the present. The Palestinian Family Unit continues to, in many, many contexts, to not accept their queer children, and we have a long way to go, although it is possible we've seen other families accept their children, so that is a possibility as well. And within the movement itself, I think what I call this radical purism does continue, where there's this significant emphasis on maintaining anti-imperialism. And sometimes what that does is that it can alienate queer Palestinians who may not subscribe to the same set of ideological principles. And so the movement really, I think, is trying to work its way through figuring out how it is that can be inclusive of queer Palestinians in our heterogeneity, given that we are a diverse community, just like any other community. And I think globally, the movement has done a very good job at sort of capturing the hearts and minds and imagination of radical, leftist, progressive LGBTQ movements in Europe, in North America, in Canada, in different parts of the world. But I think in terms of impacting mainstream LGBTQ global civil society, the queer Palestinian movement has some way to go. And so given it's at a plateau right now, one way to resume its growth, I think, could be to figure out how to engage with also mainstream LGBTQ spaces and institutions around the world as well.
What are those points of ideological purity or anti-imperialism that might alienate some people? I mean, what are the kind of sticking points?
Well, it's fascinating, and it's similar to the it is similar to the Palestinian feminist movement, because there's significant debates, people who said the liberation of the nation must precede the liberation of the woman, and then others who said, no, actually, national liberation and women's liberation have to come hand in hand. And there were these ideological splits, and there was this contestation. Ultimately, the movement really, the Palestinian feminist movement, coalesced with an understanding of the need to combine the two. Although there are other forms of feminist Palestinian movements in terms of ones that have more of an Islamist character, etc., and they have their own worldviews that are different than more, let's say, secular Palestinian nationalist feminist movements or NGOs, etc. And in the queer Palestinian movement, what we find and what I document in the book is that these debates are continuing as we speak. Where does anti-imperialism and the struggle against Zionism fit in the movement, and where does that fit in the context of queer liberation? And you have different points of view, and there are some people who do privilege the anti-imperialism over the queer liberation, and then others who are pushing back at that and saying, no, as a queer movement, we cannot have queer liberation take a backseat. It has to be front and center as well, and we have to integrate it in a really robust way and to ensure that it's a priority. And here I quote Audre Lorde, the Black American lesbian feminist poet and activist, who wrote that there's no hierarchy of oppressions. And it's essential that we remember that we cannot prioritize one over the other. All of these hierarchies of oppression are equally important. And that's a really powerful argument that I put forward in the book.
So it seems to me like you subscribe fully to the intersectionality approach to social critique. The fact that there's no a hierarchy of oppression, and also that the axes of liberation are inseparable from another. Do you accept this reading, or do you have like more a more ambivalent approach to intersectionality?
No, absolutely. Intersectionality is essential, and I think that the struggle against colonialism, racism, against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, against classism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, all of these struggles are inextricably linked, equally important, and they all intersect in very, very powerful ways, and we can't disentangle one from the other or prioritize one over the other. If we truly believe in social justice, we truly believe in human liberation, we have to include everyone, all oppressed people, all forms of oppression and intolerance without any exception.
Speaking about all forms of oppression and intolerance, one of the things you write, I think this is in the beginning, I'm just quoting you, solidarity with Palestine remains one of the most dynamic and salient domains of global queer politics today. So I'm assuming that you're talking about really, the anti-occupation liberation struggle. And this is the kind of thing that drives right-wingers crazy, because they say, why are you focusing so much on Israel and the occupation when there are LGBT, violations going on in Saudi Arabia and Iran and Nigeria? And why aren't those places the centerpiece of global queer politics? And I don't want to make you be an apologist for the whole movement, but I'm just curious, have you encountered that attitude, and what do you think about it?
Absolutely, and I think that's a quintessential form of what's called whataboutism. So if, for example, if a woman, who has breast cancer wants to talk about breast cancer, imagine if somebody comes and says, well, what about testicular cancer? There are other kinds of cancers. Why are you only talking about one? Well, yes, all forms of cancer are terrible and we should have treatments for all of them. But if someone is suffering from breast cancer, she has the right to want, that for her, that's part of her intimate experience. And so as queer Palestinians, we have every right to articulate our struggle on our own terms, to be able to talk about our own unique struggle, of course, to have an intersectional approach, to have a wider approach, to understand that other queer people in the region, around the world, are also suffering, and they too deserve liberation, and they too deserve dignity. But we cannot speak for queer people in Saudi Arabia or in Myanmar. We can only speak for ourselves. And as we speak for ourselves, we also cultivate and call for transnational global solidarity with us and with our movement. And I think one of the reasons that we've been successful in garnering that solidarity from people around the world is not because those people don't care about other struggles. No, oftentimes the people who are non-Palestinians globally in solidarity with us are also intimately involved in liberation struggles in other contexts, both in their local context and in different parts of the world. It creates a kind of straw man argument that somehow non-Palestinians in solidarity with queer Palestinians, that they just sit and focus only on Israel-Palestine all day. I've rarely seen that happen. Almost every person around the world who I've seen who've exerted social capital to really speak in support of queer Palestinians and respond to our call for solidarity themselves have extended that compassion and solidarity to others as well. And this would be, just like Black South Africans who were very successful in garnering global solidarity against apartheid there. And if people around the world were in solidarity with them, if every time those people were told, well, why are you in solidarity with Black South Africans? Why don't you care about what's happening in China, etc.? We begin to see that this is not a good faith argument. And oftentimes this whataboutism is actually designed and meant and intended to further the status quo, to try to further silence Palestinians and to try to maintain the systems of Israeli oppression.
Just a quick comment. I mean, I think you're really right. I remember the anti-apartheid struggle quite well, which is going to make Gilad laugh at me. But it really was the most prominent.
And the listeners as well.
And the listeners. It really was the most prominent social cause among such an array of social circles for a time. And I don't remember anybody saying, why are you focusing on South Africa and nothing else? Because it was a major issue that really upset people. And there were other issues going on too. But that, it was just a global movement. And I don't remember anybody saying, you're singling out South Africa. That was just a comment.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you, Saad, you didn't mention the praxis of the occupation before, but I'd like to take you one step further, because you also address or perhaps present a gendered reading of Zionism to an extent. You say that some of the traits that are intrinsic to Zionism are toxic masculinity. Can you describe how you view Zionism from that gendered perspective of yours?
Yes, and I understand Zionism from my perspective as a Palestinian. I know that there are different definitions and different conceptions of Zionism, and some from the earlier Zionist movement, and that differ from what we see on the ground. But from our perspective as Palestinian, Zionism is the very antonym, very antithesis to our identity. It's the ideological project and the political project that has led to now over 7 decades of utter dispossession, destruction, displacement of an entire nation, and the trauma of the Nakba, which is the catastrophe, the destruction of Palestine, the establishment of Israel, and its reverberations through the present continue with us. And that trauma and that suffering is very, very real. And what we see is that, this image of the Sabra, this new Jewish subject, this sort of like dark person rooted in the ground, rooted in the earth, who's disavowing, the sort of European, effeminate, victim of anti-Semitism pogroms, the Holocaust in Europe, and this desire to, quote unquote, make the desert bloom and to build, Israel, quote unquote, from scratch. And this political project is deeply, deeply, I think, mired in different kinds of gender dynamics, including a kind of toxic masculinity that remains with us through the present. But what's really fascinating is with the advent of pinkwashing, the way that those gender dynamics as they relate to Zionism become much more complex in a way that, at least on the official state discourse level, this notion, oh, look, we can integrate queer subjects into our nationalist, into our Zionist project. Look at how excellent we are at doing that. It shows what I argue, that this notion of we are so firm in our masculinity, and this masculinity is so hegemonic that we're able to integrate even the most effeminate among us, and that doesn't undermine our claim to masculinity as well. But I do think that masculinity can be very dangerous, because it leads not only to heightened militarization of Israeli society, heightened human rights abuses against Palestinians, but it also, I think, contributes in the long run even to rising rates of domestic violence within Israel, within Israeli households as well. So I think that this toxic masculinity in Israeli society and Palestinian society, it hurts all of us, whether we're Israeli or Palestinian, whether we're straight or we're queer.
We better be careful for me not to start cracking jokes about the levels of masculinity and machoism and militarism in Israeli society. Have you spent time in Israel proper? Remind us where you grew up.
So I grew up in the West Bank.
Which town?
In Ramallah.
In Ramallah. And have you spent time in Israel at all?
Not very much, no.
Okay.
But, for Palestinians, from our vantage point, all of Israel, Palestine is considered historic Palestine. So sure. These the kinds of disaggregation of the geography and the kind of separation that we see between Israel, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the broader West Bank, etc. We feel that these are colonial impositions that have been imposed on Palestinians to separate us from one another. But when I have spent time in, quote unquote, Israel proper, I haven't felt that I was somehow in a different country. I could feel the spirits of my ancestors. I feel that this is part of my ancestral homeland as well. I feel rooted there. I feel connected there, even spiritually, affectively, even if, there's Hebrew everywhere and the demographics are very different than the demographics of Ramallah, for example. We still feel very intimately connected to all of historic Palestine, all of contemporary Israel, Palestine.
I want to ask you, growing up in Ramallah in the 1990s, as you write in the preface to your book, which is really touching, I have to say, it really tells your personal story of how you came to be a researcher on this topic, and also, your story, your personal story. And I want to ask you, do you think that, if you had gone through that process in Ramallah today, would it be better or significantly better than it was when you were coming to terms with your sexuality growing up?
Definitely. And I see that very palpably because, the contexts have changed. I'm 36 years old. And when I was growing up, we had very anemic language. When it comes to queerness, we only had a few terms. They were very derogatory and dehumanizing. Now we have more robust linguistic toolkit in Arabic to talk about queerness and homosexuality, terms like mithli that are neutral in their connotation and that are used by the scientific community, by the medical community, by mental health experts, by journalists, etc. So even the very access to language is not something that I had, which young people now growing up in the West Bank do have. Another major difference is the rise of the internet, the rise of satellite, the rise of globalization, transnational flows of ideas, as well as role models. So when I was growing up, there were no role models whatsoever. I didn't know a single openly gay person at all, ever. Whereas now, this is very clear. I hope that I can be one of those role models, given that I'm public and out and write on these issues and speak on these issues. I see that very clearly on social media and other spheres where young people express their appreciation for the work that we do and others do as well. So that's, I think, very, very inspiring. And as a result, young people in Ramallah are actually accepting themselves and engaging in self-love and self-compassion as queer people at earlier and younger ages. And they're also increasingly being met with more and more support. And now they have access to more resources for support, which completely didn't exist when I was a kid.
All right, Dr. Saad Achan, Assistant Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Swarthmore College, and the author of a newly published book, Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique, was published by Stanford University Press last year. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thanks for ending on such an optimistic note.
Absolutely. And also thanks to Itai Shellam, our producer and sound engineer. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You can support us by going to a website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 600 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and Dalia on Twitter. And most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.